All right. Well, thanks very much for tuning in. My name is Hugh, and I'm an iOS developer for itty bitty apps. I've been thinking about documentation and clear commenting for a while. I've always been a fan of comments and how they can help us. But only sometimes do they help us. Sometimes they're a hindrance too. I wanted to do a talk about it, mainly to set my thoughts in order about how and why they help and how we can make the best efforts to make good documentation. So I titled the talk Enough Documentation because I want to stress that we only need enough documentation, not too much and not too waffly. Enough documentation to make it clear and consistent and easy to maintain. So unless you've been living in a bunker underground, and I honestly can understand if you are, you will already understand that documentation is necessary. You don't have to look very hard to find developers frustrated at the lack of docs. We instinctively understand that docs will aid both ourselves and anybody consuming our code. Remember, computer code is a form of human communication. If you fail to communicate clearly, you will frustrate your readers. Commentary and documentation are a way of adding clarity and meaning to your code when the code itself cannot do it by itself. Typically, however, developers don't give much thought to documentation. It's left as an afterthought, a low priority task to fix up once everything else is done and we have a few spare minutes. Those minutes never come, of course, and so the problem continues. Firstly, however, I don't know about you, but advice from my senior colleagues has varied throughout my career. At one stage, comments were absolutely essential and needed to be in every place possible. At another point, documentation was scorned as a failure of the programmer to write clear enough code. Right away, I want to point out that this code documents itself is a load of dingo's kidneys. Aside from trivial examples, this will never be the case. Imagine if someone said, UIKit has no documentation, it's self-documenting. No, I don't think that's likely. Plainly, that's silly. Clearly, some docs are necessary. How much? That depends. We can talk about that later. Let's constrain ourselves first. I want to focus just on developer documentation. Documentation written for the eyes of other developers, not for managers or BAs and so on. They might want to muscle in on your documentation and make it about the project, but let's resist that. Their needs are valid and their ideas are important, but let's constrain our discussion to just the developer documentation. But Hugh, I can hear you saying, writing comments is hard. Yes, it is hard. Coding is difficult too. So is learning SwiftUI and Combine, and we manage that mostly so far. I want people to start thinking of documentation as an integral part of software development process, a modern best practice, if you will, as inherent as unit testing and as necessary as accessibility. So since this is for developers, by developers, where should we put it? We want it to be as close to hand as possible. So the best place to put your documentation is in the code itself. I mean in the same Git repository, surrounded by the code, amongst it and part of it. We're going to apply all of our usual developer best practices to it. It's checked in and looked after as if it were code. If it's too far away, stored in some other system like a wiki, then it'll get out of date, and as developers move on, you won't know where to find it or whose job it is to look after it. When it's close by, everyone already has a copy and everyone knows how to update it. This screenshot is from the GitHub page of the RX Swift project. I'm not saying its documentation is perfect. I myself have submitted patches, but it does exemplify what I mean. Here, the documentation has gone into a directory at the root of the project, a fine place to store it. Though RX Swift is a big public project, it has loads of documentation because it's quite complex and consumed by so many people. Yes, code written for the consumption of public is always going to have a greater need for documentation. That doesn't exonerate you, however. What should we put in your private repos documentation directory? In most projects I've been on, particularly the ones which have lasted more than a few months, big decisions get made regarding the architectural structure of the project that have profound implications. But people forget about why we did something, and what the people were thinking of at the time. Often the people who made the decision have long since vanished. For example, why did we decide not to use Interface Builder? Does anyone remember why we switched from CocoaPods to Carthage? That sort of thing. One way to counteract this problem, and many others, is to use architectural decision records, or ADRs for short. This is a record of any kind of large, significant change to the non-functional characteristics of the system. They should provide the design rationale for the decision, and they should talk about the trade-offs and attributes of the decisions and answer the why questions about the option selected. They're usually a byproduct of a meeting or a discussion among engineers, or maybe a spike even. This website has loads of great information about them, and it's even translated into German. A good tip to start using ADRs is to just adopt a template and pop it into your documentation directory. They don't have to be much. They just need a title, what it's about, a date, some context to explain what's going on and what's surrounding the decision itself, what you've agreed to, the status. ADRs last forever. You don't delete them. If you change your mind about something, you can write in here, superseded, please see some other ADR. Any further consequences or side effects, you should also note that here. ADRs are often numbered as well, just so you can keep track of them. So ADR 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Mostly, however, when we're talking about developer documentation, what we're talking about is comments. This is where the bulk of your docs will be, and it probably already is. These days, there are some excellent tools you can get to generate pretty HTML from your code comments. I got this one here working in minutes. This is SwiftDoc. It automatically generates a nice HTML site from your code comments. You can set it up as a GitHub action or as just part of your build pipeline, publish it to a place where the consumer can read it, and most importantly, they can search it. This is an example of the output of SwiftDoc run against an open source project which we've mentioned tonight. It's Vexel by our friend Rob. Rob's taken the time to carefully write commentary as he's written his code. The payoff is now his project has a big set of documentation. Not everyone's going to want to publish the documentation like this, though. You're probably working on private code. However, I think that if you pretend you're going to publish it, even if you never plan to, you will get the best results. Even if you never integrate these sorts of tools, the discipline will pay off, like compound interest. Now, there are some rules to follow when you're writing comments. They're not onerous, but you need to follow them in order to have them convert into this sort of documentation. So let's talk a bit about this now. Chances are you may already know about some of this, but I'm going to go through it anyway because not everyone knows it. So it's Xcode, not necessarily Swift, has some pretty good built-in tooling for documenting your code. It's the conventions like these that tools like SwiftDoc and SwiftLint use to do their work. For example, did you know you could use much of the features of Markdown in your comments? You might not have noticed it before because it's kind of hidden. Ordinarily in Swift, comments start with a double slash. If you start with a triple slash, like here, Xcode considers this to be a documentation comment, and it'll format it with some Markdown rules. By default, Xcode formats it with Helvetica, but you can set it up to use a monospace font if you wish, and I strongly recommend that. When you attach these sorts of comments, these documentation comments, to a function, this is where the fun really starts. Rather than relying on the function signature to explain what's going on, we can annotate the function to add extra information. In the first line, we have the simple function description. The leading paragraph of the documentation comment becomes the documentation summary. This is short and sweet and should be easy to skim. Everything else is discussion. If people want more information, they can look there. Xcode recognizes a few special fields as well and makes them separate. For example, the line with parameters, if you start the line with parameters, you can have a special list of parameters. There's all sorts of additional fields you can use here: throws, returns, preconditions, see also, etc. They're all there. Take a look at the website in the link here, and it goes into much more detail. I'll chuck that link into Slack in a minute. When it's all done, Xcode puts your documentation comment in the quick help. So if you option click on a symbol in Xcode, it'll bring up the window on the left. I use this all the time, mostly for UI kit because it's already written by Apple, but if I've written it too, then I get the benefit. It also puts the summary in the autocomplete pop-up. So if you're looking for what you want, it's important for your summary to be easy to scan. So, but my favorite thing to do is to put in diagrams. So I find this particular sentence to be impenetrable. Don't bother reading it. I could read it 5 times and not understand it. It's very hard to write about RX Swift, and you just end up blathering and waffling, and it's difficult. It's probably an error in this. I don't know. Pictures say 1,000 words. It's good to draw a bit of a diagram to get the point across. This is a simple marble diagram drawn with plain text characters. It's inside a markdown code block. So that's the 3 backticks at the top and bottom of the diagram. So Xcode knows to format it with a monospaced font. And I think this is much clearer now. And it looks good in the Quick Look Inspector as well. So I use Monodraw for this. It's an excellent Mac app for drawing ASCII diagrams. Although I can't show you any today, my friend Simon used it to draw great diagrams to explain how some UIKit views worked with their constraints and how they'd interact. He was building complex views with graphs and layers, and having a diagram really helped out when I came in and needed to modify the code. So consider every time you want to explain something and you reach for a pen and paper to draw a sketch, could you also draw it in the markdown code block? This may save someone a bit of pain later on. Now, just because I like comments, this doesn't mean I want people to start writing comments like this one. You don't need a comment on every single function and every variable and every data structure and everything. Swift already has keywords which are plain English already. And this comment here says nothing that the function signature doesn't already say. What's more, it leaves us open to a few problems. Why is it returning a uint? What's the third parameter for? And what does integrate even mean? To fix this, we'll need to explain what integrate means and what the parameters are for. If integrate is obvious in context, then you don't need the comment. It's not necessary, and you should delete it because it's dead code. Restrict your code comments to discussing things which can't be explained by the code itself. The code is sort of the how, and the comment will sort of be the why, as it were. So before I finish on comments, there's one more kind of comment that I'd like to talk about. It's simple, plain git commit messages. These are a kind of comment. There's a lot of good prior art about good commit messages, so I'm not going to go into it, but the rules here are similar to writing good comments. That is, bad ones are worse than none at all, and simple is best. The thing about git commits is you have to write them, so it pays to do it properly. Personally, I have a simple pattern and I just stick to it. You don't have to follow it rigidly, and not all commits need to have all of it. I write a single line summary in the top, a very short sentence. And then I write previously, blah, 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 something about the code as it was before the commit. And then now I explain the change I made. Like a lot of this stuff, it all adds up. This one pays off quickly because it helps me to write full-bodied and complete pull requests, because most of what I want to say is already in the commit messages. So before I leave you, I have a few other thoughts. Firstly, don't use pretentious and grandiose words when simple ones will do. You want to circumvent grotesque loquacity. In other words, don't talk too much. The person who will read your comments hasn't got a lot of time. Most of the time, a single sentence will do. Avoid waffling. And secondly, keep it simple. There is a lot of information you can embed in comments. You don't need all of it most of the time. It's probably better if you don't. Remember, the result of this is to create a simple document that someone is going to scan with their eyes to find their answers. Too long and they won't read it. Effective documentation covers the right material. If you have reams of it, no one will bother reading it, and all your hard work will be for nothing. And last, it's handy to have a style guide. Most people won't need this, but they are handy to fall back on. I use the Australian government one. It's very complete and quite good. That's a slide that's blank. So it remains for me to simply say thank you for your time. My name is Hugh, and I hope I've given you some ideas about how you can communicate more clearly with your friends and colleagues through your code. I'll see you on Slack. Back to you, Matthew.
Thanks, you. That was an amazing and insightful talk about documentation. I learned that someone had put this idea of ADRs into actual formal words, which is pretty encouraging. And I loved the artistic use of the spacebar on the mechanical keyboard. Sounded like you were thumping the return on a typewriter or something similar in order to get through your slides. So like, right, smash, docs, smash. It was really good, really engaging talk, and I loved it and learnt a whole heap. Next up, we have Pablo, who is going to give us an overview of Flutter from an iOS developer's perspective.